Darwin received a letter from a virtual nobody, Alfred Russel Wallace. So who was this chap? He was born in 1823 in Wales. He was English, but born to English parents in Wales. He left school at 14 because his parents could not afford education anymore. So a marked difference to Darwin, who was sent to the best schools in England and Scotland. And Wallace had to earn a living very early on. So he was working with his brother as a surveyor. So he traveled around the English countryside, learned how to make maps, which would become very important for him later in his life as an explorer. And he had a chance to observe wildlife out in the open, and he became very passionate about insects during that time. His brother's business had problems, financial problems, so he was unemployed for a short while, and then he was hired as a teacher in a school in Leicester to teach drawing and the art of surveying. And at that school he had access to a large library in which he started reading exactly the same books that also inspired Darwin. And he also read Malthus's treatise on the study of population. So he was engaged. He started looking at many of the same books and philosophers that Darwin was also studying. Importantly, he read Chambers's Vestiges of the Natural History, and he was inspired. He saw the speculations in that book as something that would be worth, like empirically studying and supporting. So together with his mate Bates, he set off on a trip to South America, to the Amazon. He spent a couple of years in the Rio Negro region in the Amazon basin, and he started collecting animal species. So as I told you, he was very poor, and for him it was one way to make money. So he was engaged in scientific discovery. At the same time, he would send his specimen back to collectors in England, and he would be paid through that. Finally, he decided to return to England with all the animals and observations that he had made during his time in the Amazon basin. And as he was setting sail, his ship caught fire, and so he lost everything that he had owned or that he had collected. So all his observations, his drawings, his specimen that he wanted to sell were gone. So when he finally got back in 1852 to England, he was poor. Luckily, one of the collectors had insured the specimen, so he got a bit of money, but he was desperate to get out again and continue his discoveries. So he was thinking, where could he make a mark on natural history? And he was thinking about the Malay archipelago. It was part of the English dominion, so he had easier access to that, and it was virtually unknown during that time. So he was very excited to go there. So in 1854 he set off to Singapore, and he started exploring the area around Singapore, Malaysia and Indonesia. He would travel in a tremendous distance, so he would cover 14,000 miles in those years there. He would collect over 125,000 different animals. He would discover 5,000 new animals that were not described scientifically before him. And he learned the local language. He learned Bahasa Malayu, and he stayed during his trips. He stayed with local tribes around the area, and it was also a marked difference to Darwin. Darwin was a gentleman. He would always observe from a distance, coming on shore for short periods of time, and he would always have this kind of distance, whereas Wallace was actually living with people that were in their natural environment, and he would learn a lot about nature by interacting with them. And so he stayed, for example, with the very infamous Dayak headhunters, and he observed that the more he spends time with what other people considered primitive, the more positive he became about human nature. So a very different attitude compared to Darwin. So in 1855, Wallace wrote a paper on Sarawak, which would become known as the Sarawak paper, in which he argued that species would always emerge in the same area with closely allied species. Lyell had read that paper, and he alerted Darwin to this paper, and he said, like, look, there's a chap out there somewhere that seems to have very similar ideas to what you're proposing. But Darwin kind of dismissed this idea because he thought like he was really onto something radically new and nobody else would come up with the same ideas. And importantly, Wallace at that moment had not really described the mechanism yet. So Darwin dismissed it and thought it would be another theologist that would describe a natural history of species using divine laws. So in 1858, at the beginning of 1858, Wallace came down with a fever, most likely malaria. So as he was on Ternate Island, he was in his feverish dreams, he started suddenly making sense of the observations that he had gathered over the years. So all the variation that he observed on these different islands, he would actually discover some important biogeographic laws in due time. And he remembered in his feverish dreams, he remembered that treatise by Malthus, and suddenly it all came together. You know, similar to Darwin, Malthus's work provided the mechanism and framework that suddenly put everything into place. So Wallace, still in his feverish state, started writing a letter, and he sent it off to Darwin. They had been in correspondence for about 2 years at that time, and asked Darwin, in case that the good sir deems the argument interesting, please pass it on to Lyell and get it submitted for publication. And now, between this March 9th date that Wallace argues that he sent off his letter, a big argument, historical argument emerges. Lots of conspiracy theories. Because sometime between June 9th and June 18th, the letter arrived in England. And so the matter of the issue right now is when the letter arrived, because Darwin was not ready yet to publish his thesis. Yet there was somebody there that seemed to have exactly the same ideas, the same mechanism. And so Darwin received the letter at some point, and he passed it on to Lyell and Hooker and asked them, what should I do? And they came up with what Hooker described a delicate, or what Lyell described, a delicate agreement, a gentleman's agreement. What happened is that they decided that an abstract of the 1844 sketch that Darwin had written would be read together with Wallace's paper at the setting of the Linnaean Society. So in this case, Darwin would actually get the credit for being first, and Wallace's paper would be read at the same time. So this happened. Darwin unfortunately could not attend because his young baby boy just had died, and obviously Wallace was on the other side of the world. So the reading happened. Not much happened actually after the reading immediately, but Darwin really now went into a feverish effort to finish his book, because nobody knew what else this chap Wallace, that nobody really knew much about, was up to. Maybe he had a whole manuscript in the workings and would scoop Darwin. So Darwin worked really, really hard to get his book out. And so finally in 1859, towards the end of 1859, his book would come out, and it would be an immediate success, because Darwin, he laid out his arguments with lots of observations, linking it back to Paley's arguments. So he linked it to theology, he linked it to the thinking of economists. So he was able to bring everyone together and follow along his line of reasoning. So would Wallace have had the same impact? We don't know. He was a nobody. Darwin was part of the high society. He was an esteemed scholar, an authority on biology, geology. So people were paying attention to what he was talking about. So this was an important milestone, 1859, the publication of The Origin of Species.